Good afternoon. I'm Dan Post. I'm a recent PhD graduate and professor at the Naval War College down in Newport, and also a Watson Military Fellow here with the Military Fellows Program. And it's my pleasure to introduce Admiral Retired Phil Davidson for our talk today. We've been having a nice visit last night. We had dinner and some lunch today, and see some familiar faces here who were at some of those events. So we're really looking forward to the talk today. I'll do a brief introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Admiral Davidson, and we'll also do a Q&A period after the remarks. And you can see there's 2 microphones here set up. I should just be able to walk up to those, and I'll kind of coordinate that as we go. So when we get to the Q&A section, that's how we'll do that. So Admiral Davidson, thank you for coming. We're really happy to have you. So I think many of you probably know some of this. I won't take long at all. But Admiral Davidson has been retired now for 3 years almost to the month even from the United States Navy after 39 years of service. So we appreciate that. I thank you for your service. And his last command was as the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, Indo-Pacom. And that is our largest geographic combatant command, spanning half the globe, and just lots of things going on in that AOR. And Admiral Davidson did an admirable job running that, and an admiral job. He was actually an admiral, yeah. Prior to that, of course, he was a Navy surface warfare officer, so he commanded different kinds of ships all over the world, and has now retired and has been doing some things in business on the board of directors for various organizations, even on the Brown University Board of Governors, I think they call it, not Board of Directors. Oh, sorry, Watson Institute. Thank you.
Yeah,
Board of Governors.
To be in the Brown Board of Governors, you have to be a Brown graduate.
Right. Oh, okay.
I think it's like 99%.
Okay. Well, so we'll see what we can do about that one, sir. But I think I'll stop there and let you take over, sir. But just thank you again for coming. We're happy to have you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Oh, please, you're kind. Thank you. Thank you, Dan, for the introduction. I'm surprised to see so many here at 4 o'clock on a Thursday. I did find out immediately before this session what the attraction is. There is free food at the end. No? Yes. All right. Very good. All right. Thank you. I have to thank Ed Steinfeld for inviting me today. I have to thank Melissa Milner and Christy Kilgus, who I don't think is in here and probably never gets credit or recognized for all their support in bringing me here. Ed, from me to you, you have done an extraordinary job here at Watson, and now you and Watson are off to bigger things. That is the perfect outcome for an effort like you've put in these 8 or 9 years, so well done to you. I intend to speak for about 20 minutes or so, because I think it's important to set the context. You and I know I can't possibly address everything that's going on in the Indo-Pacific in 20-odd minutes. And that's not my intent, but I'll take a swing at some of what I believe is topical here. If I see boredom really truly break out, I'll take a couple off ramps and just wrap it up and go to questions. But I think it's important to have some context. I spoke last week at Yale at a predominantly Navy audience. And in preparation, I was reviewing some Navy history because it was the weekend. It was April 6th. And one of the things I noted about April 6th is a very phenomenal date in U.S. Navy history, right? I mean, April 6, 1917, the United States chooses to go to war, declares war on Germany because of the attacks on merchant shipping. Peary goes to the North Pole on April 6th in 1907. There's just a bunch of dates. But April 6, 1945, the very first really heavy kamikaze attacks commence on U.S. shipping at the Battle of Okinawa. So I want you to think about everybody, Okinawa, big battle. This is 4 months before the end of World War II. And by that I mean the end. It's only 1 month before VE Day. The heaviest kamikaze attacks, and in between then, April 6th, and VJ Day in early September, or whenever it is, September 12th, 334 ships are damaged, 35 sunk by kamikaze attacks. Think of it, just 4 months before the end of World War II, the sacrifices made. I think of that World War II generation a lot. Their courage, their pluck, their resolve, their defense of our liberal values in combat then and in the post-war years shaping the international community of nations later. And how all of that delivered to us, all of us here in this room today, a legacy of prosperity and security for nearly 80 years now. The benefits accrued to us today were probably inconceivable to them then. Certainly I don't think it was planned, but I, for one, am grateful for it. Now, I speak rather frequently all across America, and my thesis is pretty simple. In short, I believe that liberal values are under assault by the world's autocratic regimes, by Russia and the People's Republic of China, certainly, and for that matter, by terrorist organizations like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, and like Hamas. And by liberal values, I mean the political and moral philosophy based on the rights of the individual, liberty, self-determination, consent of the governed, and equality before the law. Now, I said I speak a lot across America. And usually at this point, I remind them what it means to be American. And by that, I don't mean America like has become the, rather obscene meme over the last 20 years, but the foundation, the roots of America as it was born, right? And I cite Thomas Paine for them, who wrote the pamphlet Common Sense, was a lot of the conscience behind America as it pursues its trajectory and its freedom of arbitrary restraint from the crown. And of course, Thomas Paine said, in large measure, the cause of America, in large measure, is the cause of all mankind. And for the rest of the globe, that's what America means to them. And I think that's really, really important to cite. And when I'm talking to all kinds of audiences, full of cowboy hats in Texas, full of tech elites in Boston and Silicon Valley, it kind of reminds them why the United States has been so active in its engagements with the rest of the globe and why U.S. global leadership is so important. More than anything, I hope that the impact of that thesis, along with my discussion about our global leadership and why it's important, is to convey the idea that it is worth the cost and effort now to engage globally, to work to prevent conflict, to deter war in order to ensure our security and our prosperity, the benefits derived from our global leadership and the continued defense of our liberal values. So, some of you may know my statement of more than 3 years ago now. It came up last night at dinner. I was asked by the Senate Armed Services Committee in public testimony, what does China's alarming activities do to your timeline if you're extrapolating out with regard to any potential conflict or timeline in the Taiwan Strait? That's a quote. And I said, after repeating some of the alarming activities that China was doing, I said, and I quote, I think our concerns are manifest this decade and in fact in the next 6 years. So I said that 3 years ago. That made a little news at the time, earned a meme called the Davidson window, which you can find periodically in the press, but within weeks was effectively affirmed by the U.S. Secretary of State and the Director of National Intelligence. But let's take stock of what the global security environment looks like right now. First, Russia's assault on Ukraine grinds on with no clear outcome in sight. Russia's counter to Ukraine's counteroffensive has made some headway, but as I said last week, last month, last year even, we're a long way from knowing what the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war is. The three involved parties, Russia and Ukraine, of course, but NATO, or more fairly, really, the West, because it includes Australia, Japan, and others. These three parties are in a position where they cannot afford to lose, or at least cannot appear to have lost. Putin has cast this for the Russian people in terms of the Great War, World War II in the Russian parlance, and a war against fascism, making it appear to the Russian people that the outcome for Russia is existential. President Zelensky in Ukraine know that an outcome where Russia occupies some portion of Ukraine will only allow Russia to rest, rearm, and reset for a potentially renewed assault on Kyiv or more widely across Ukraine in the months and years to come. They've seen this movie once already, right? The West cannot afford to lose because we know it will fundamentally recast the security relationships, not only in Europe, but probably globally, and in a way that undermines not only our physical security for the long term, but our long-term economic security as well. In the Indo-Pacific, as I've said before, the People's Republic of China is definitely taking a lesson or three away from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Foremost, with what I'm going to describe, we cannot forget that on virtually the eve of Russia's attack on Ukraine, the PRC and Russia agreed to a no-limits partnership. Now, what is the baseline of activity by the PRC in the region over the last several years? Well, the short version, I visited Taiwan a year ago, and they described the last 2 years in their security environment as the most severe in their history. So what are some of the details? The PRC has continued to erode the day-to-day operating norms, military operating norms, in and around Taiwan, with ever more routine violations of Taiwan's air defense identification zone, crossings of the midline in the strait between Taiwan and the mainland, now multi-domain blockade rehearsals, multi-domain attack demonstrations, and by that I mean, from all directions and domains, demonstrations from space, air, on the sea, from land, etc. Additionally, the PRC continues to subvert the international ruling on the law of the sea in the South China Sea, and it pursues physical confrontation in the last couple of months with ships and aircraft from the Philippines principally, but there are some interesting air-to-air and sea-to-sea and air-to-sea interactions with U.S., with Australian, with Canadian, with the U.K., ships and aircraft in the South China Sea as well. Diplomatically, the PRC continues a campaign to coerce, co-opt, and corrupt other countries, international diplomatic organizations, some of their influencers, and business and political elites around the globe to undermine the overall security landscape. The PRC also continues its integration of PRC civil military entities, continues to deepen the reach of its national security laws, and continues to follow Chairman Xi's edict to the PLA to be ready and fight and win by 2027. Those that argue that the risk of conflict in Taiwan or in the Taiwan Strait are mostly dependent upon the PLA's readiness to conduct an amphibious invasion are failing to understand the lessons of Russia-Ukraine or the evolving battlefield as we're seeing it. So while sobering, the PLA is learning not only that ground operations are grinding, slow affairs, but the real takeaway is how do you solve that problem, right? And their takeaway is that all domain effects delivered in a much more comprehensive attack are the key lessons learned. Now, earlier, I mentioned the benefits accrued to us from the World War II generation. Those benefits have obligations, yes, perhaps even burdens, if you will, as well. I think it is our job, America, to help prevent such a comprehensive attack on one, particularly when it's a free nation like Taiwan, sorry about the clarification, while also ensuring the day-to-day international norms are not eroded in such ways that the security architecture for the many simply collapses as well. Now, there are myriad other challenges in the security environment, right, in the Middle East, in the 6 months of combat action that's going on in the Red Sea right now involving the U.S. Navy, and elsewhere, but in the interest of time, let's move to some of the encouraging developments, the opportunities that we must note. First, despite what you read in the news, the international order remains firmly opposed to Russia's assault on Ukraine. Economic sanctions against Russia were swiftly applied, not only by NATO and the Eastern European nations, and we can talk about some of the weaknesses there, but it was reinforced also by nations that believe in reinforcing the international order, right? Nations like Japan and Australia. In all, that is a collective demonstration of the resiliency of international collective will. Further, energy supplies have been rerouted and aid continues to flow to Ukraine. And again, we can talk more about that. Ukraine has fought quite bravely and remains resolute in its defense. The power of unanimity across the NATO alliance is noteworthy as well. These are lessons for the international community of nations, the rules-based international order, and our mutual interest in the rule of law and the importance of allies to us here in the United States. So let me be clear. The United States' ability to marshal its allies in common cause, our leadership, is every bit as important as Ukraine's will to fight. All right, what is the next? The U.S. has allies that can be counted upon. In the Indo-Pacific, one needs only to look at the AUKUS agreement, both phases 1 and 2, as well as Japan's announcements over the last year or so to know that we have allies that are willing to contribute money, manpower, and their military might. There is no doubt that AUKUS Phase 1, the nuclear submarine trajectory for Australia, if you're not familiar, is a long game, maybe even a very long game. But when a country with the population of Australia, less than 30 million, puts down a stretch goal like this, then Annie's up with $3 billion. Yes, that's billion with a B. We know they're doing much more than trying to buy a submarine. There's a bit to fret over here, and we can get into some of those specifics, but there's a lot to be positive about when it comes to the strengths it adds to the alliance now and later. In my mind, Phase 2 is perhaps an easier lift since we already have deep connections in space, cyberspace, intelligence, and defense technology development already with Australia. And not just government to government, but business to business relationships as well. I was in Australia in November, and I like where we are very much. In America, we should know Australia is in when it comes to the security environment in the Indo-Pacific, and that is a tremendous plus. Now, I was in Japan twice last year, and here we are this week with another incredibly important evolution in the U.S.-Japan alliance. I think we should absolutely note the very important announcements related to the new national security policy in Japan, as well as the alliance announcements made in what was known in Washington, D.C. as Japanuary in Japanuary 2023, when Prime Minister Kishida and President Biden in Washington met in Washington, excuse me. Since then, I've told numerous audiences in America that the most important security development countering China's threat to the region is indeed the new national security policy of Japan, and I still believe that. I think it's the most important security development that has occurred in the Indo-Pacific since the turn of the century. I've also reminded American audiences again and again that there's no more important alliance to the overall security of East Asia than the U.S.-Japan alliance. Australia, the UK, Canada, all the others, absolutely important to have when we think about the challenges in Northeast Asia and the East China Sea, but Japan is indispensable. Now, the announcements made by President Biden and Prime Minister Kishida in Japanuary 2023 are as critical as Japan's December 22 announcements, which I'll get to in a minute. What were those alliance announcements? Well, it was first and foremost the extension of Article 5 of our U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty. Article 5 is the article in which we're committed to each other's mutual defense. That was extended to space, which is very important to Japan. I'll come back to that. The agreement to begin improvements to our U.S. operational design and military posture, our basing of our organizations here, with the reorganization for a Marine Littoral Regiment and the establishment of a composite watercraft company in Japan, very, very important. We were not able to move pieces in Japan for going back nearly 5 decades before January of 23. And importantly, very importantly, the recognition that our two nations' national security and defense strategies have converged paves the way for even more collaboration and development, and indeed paved the way for the meeting this week. Prime Minister Kishida is again in Washington. They had a state dinner last evening. There are important announcements this week in how we are going to evolve the U.S.-Japan operational command and control for the alliance, defense export policy, defense industrial capacity in Japan and how it might be better leveraged to serve the U.S.-Japan alliance, in space cooperation where the United States has agreed to take a Japanese citizen to be the first non-American on the moon, and importantly, a trilateral meeting between today, President Biden, Prime Minister Kishida, and President Marcos of the Philippines that will reflect not only Japan's deepening international influence, but altogether weaves together the bilateral threads that is the United States alliance with Japan, the United States alliance with the Philippines, into a more collective coalition-like fabric. I must also add the incredible developments in our U.S.-Japan economic cooperation in semiconductor, AI, biotech, supply chains, as well as in critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. There are still other developments, but it's safe to say that the past 15 months or so has been a remarkable one for the U.S.-Japan alliance, and I would say the most remarkable 15 months in our 60-plus year history. Many of the discussion over several decades was how confident can we be in Japan's response if, U.S. interests were challenged over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, if the Philippines. Japan's new security policy is a critical development in the ability to deter the PRC from misadventure in the Taiwan Strait, from the East China Sea, and frankly, more broadly in the Indo-Pacific. Their policy includes a stated increase in defense and national security-related investment to nearly 2% of GDP, 57% improvement in their defense budget from a year ago to this year, the policy to possess counterattack capabilities, offensive capabilities, which has not been part of Japan's self-defense force portfolio for 60-odd years, the strengthening of cybersecurity practices and development of cyber and space forces, critically important. The incredible adjustments you don't even know about that the Japanese self-defense forces are making in their own operational posture across the Southwest Islands, that is the Ryukyus. New access agreements for the UK and Australia, and a clear articulation identifying the PRC as Japan's greatest strategic challenge. That's frankly a game changer in terms of our alliance network, writ large, the security architecture we're talking about on the region, and sends a profound signal to the rest of the region that Japan no longer stands alone. All of these developments in the last year or so are unarguably positive. There's other encouraging development, right? The CHIPS Act here in the United States, the U.S. extension of the Compact of Free Association Agreements with Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands, the hardening of the government of the Philippines' approach to defending its rights in the South China Sea. We can go on, but still more is needed. More is needed from our U.S.-Japan alliance, from the U.S.-Australia alliance, from the U.S.-Philippines alliance, from the U.S.-Korea alliance, from Taiwan, the Philippines, the international community, and of course, there's a lot the PRC could do to help us in the region. Time is of the essence, though. But again, in the interest of time, I'm going to set aside the diplomatic, the economic, and the technological, and speak to the still all too slow U.S. military needs to help deter. As I said, the clock is running. So what do we still need to do militarily? I know there are ROTC students here and veterans, so I'm going to speak to you now specifically. So militarily, I think there's 4 big bins of things we need to worry about. First, we need to improve our joint lethality. So this means more and more capable long-range offensive fires capable of striking stationary and moving targets. Well, you say to yourself, well, of course we have that stuff. Well, yeah, we have some stuff, but not in the capacity that you think, right? The last 20 years, we were buying stuff designed to strike stationary targets. And the few things that we had to strike moving targets were really lightweight and small and designed to kill personnel, not large things like ships and other assets. These fires that I'm talking about, they got to come from sea, they got to come from air, they got to come from land, and they have to come from space and cyberspace. They must be manned, and yes, unmanned, and we need the sensing, the fires networks, and the platforms to go with them. Number 2, we have to commit to improving our operational design and posture in the region. What's that mean? Well, you have to take care of the geography at the operational level, right? New geography in space and cyberspace, the vast sea and air domains that is the Indo-Pacific, You have to understand our fixed bases and infrastructure. And through it all, we have to figure out how to harden and defend, find and develop expeditionary sites we can move to. We have to develop the joint concepts that allow us to do that, provide the sustainment, logistics, et cetera. And we have to be able to create the virtue of mass without the vulnerability of concentration. And we need to do it in the first island chain, that is Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, down through Singapore. The second island chain, which runs out to the, Guam, I'm sorry, down through Papua New Guinea, down to Australia, and then the third island chain, which includes Hawaii. There are those in this country that believe a fight in the Indo-Pacific can be won with assets from the continental United States. That's not true. And by that, I mean, they can't necessarily be employed from the United States. You've actually got to deploy and be there. All right, we have to improve our cooperation on our allied command and control to deliver a joint allied force that can win. That's a logical next step that has to be advanced now. This means we have to improve not only our planning with allies like Japan, but we have to start to integrate our day-to-day operational understanding of what's happening in the battle space, international sea and airspace, and what our combined operations can do to help deter, and then if required, help win. So this means more transparency in our allied exercises. We have a series of bilateral exercises with Japan, for example. The Keen series of exercises, Keen Sword, Keen Edge, all these other things. In our history, we've really never allowed other nations to participate in those except as observers, which generally means they don't have forces or staff to actually participate. You won't see that Keen series of exercises be purely bilateral anymore. They're now going to transition to multilateral and drive more transparency into it. But we have to find out what we can do together. The US, Japan, Australia, the UK, and yes, the Philippines and Korea, and perhaps on occasion Taiwan, in our operations to manage the risks from the PRC and to deter their adventurism in the East China Sea and vis-a-vis Taiwan. We also need to combine efforts to strengthen our allies and partners with intelligence, and information sharing is a very powerful tool for the United States and has been very successful both in my time in command and since in other AORs. We have to take advantage of more interoperability with our combined technology and better access. There's much more we can do in information, allied and partner networks, and intelligence sharing in the near term to help deter and prevent war immediately. There are some obligations on our allies when it comes to this. A lot of this has to do with, counterintelligence programs and their own cybersecurity practices and things like that. But if they do that, we should be very proactive in more robust intelligence sharing and a network that can knit it all together. There's another element to this, and that includes consistent and robust arms sales to Taiwan. We got to help Taiwan deter day after day, okay? Not just deliver tools that they could use in case they're attacked, all right? It doesn't do any good when the enemy has already attacked their network spaces and beaches. Ukrainian forces are doing very well in combat, but the point is to send the arms and material that will help deter an attack, not do well in an attack. I say it all across America, a failure of deterrence in the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere in the East China Sea or South China Sea would be an economic and human tragedy unlike any other the world has suffered in the last 50 years. Please don't be misled. Drones, loitering munitions, AI, robotics, cyber attacks, and electronic warfare effects like jamming and deception do not make warfare safer for humans. There is much more violence. There are just about 400,000 dead and wounded in the Russia-Ukraine war alone. So we need to take that to heart. Americans want to know what it takes to prevent war. When it takes is important too. Action now, despite the political, the diplomatic, the military and economic effort, is more practical sooner than later. The conditions in Ukraine right now are horrific. The country's in ruins. It'll be too late to wait until Taiwan is potentially ruined by coercion eroded operating norms, blockade, missile and cyber barrage, misinformation, a whole separate topic we could spend time on, and or a much more comprehensive attack. It only takes the will from the international community and from us here in the United States. I believe the rest of the world is counting on us. Think about what they all make of this, right? Not the United States, not Australia, not Japan, the UK, or the EU. Think about the rest of the world, countries like Ukraine and Taiwan, nations that lie outside the alliance system with the United States, right? It's 190-odd countries on the planet. There's about 40 in some kind of alliance, a little less, with the United States, whether they're bilateral or collective like NATO. When we think about those 150 other countries, is their cause worthy of us? Is it in our interest? If not, do countries like Ukraine and Taiwan simply abandon their pursuit of liberal values that I talked about at the very beginning? A reason for America and Americans' respect. Do they simply abandon their pursuit of liberal values, their security and prosperity, and submit to despotic rule? Bend the knee. In that case, do you think after they'll be free to exchange with us, trade with us, share their innovations or ideas with us? How about ours with them? Does our prosperity and our security depend upon those exchanges? I think they do. I think it is absolutely in our interest to prevent outcomes like these, to act now, to actually deter conflict. So I'm going to wrap it up right there. That was longer than I had hoped, but give you all the opportunity to ask me some questions. So thank you for your time and attention. Thanks.